And I'm your host, Sonali Kolhatkar. Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines the word grift in this way: to obtain money illicitly, as in a confidence game. The title of Rolling Stone contributor Matt Taibbi's new book is then fairly straightforward, sort of. It's called Griftopia: Bubble Machines, Vampire Squids, and the Long Con that is Breaking America. Taibbi is perhaps best known as the astute, if brash, journalist who in 2009 described Goldman Sachs as, quote, a great vampire squid wrapped around the face of humanity, relentlessly jamming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money. In this new book, Griftopia, he analyzes the Tea Party phenomenon, Alan Greenspan's role in the financial crisis, the mortgage scam, the commodities bubble, and healthcare reform, all in his trademark colorful eloquence. The book is described by one reviewer as the most lucid, justifiably angry description of what happened and what continues to happen to our nation's economy. Matt Taibbi is the contributing editor of Rolling Stone magazine. He's the author of The Great Derangement, Spanking the Donkey, and Smells Like Dead Elephants. Welcome to Uprising, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
Well, you certainly have a penchant for interesting titles for your book. Let's start with the Tea Partiers and their allies in Congress before we get to the likes of Goldman Sachs. You describe in your book the moment when CNBC's Rick Santelli ranted on television about the mortgage crisis, managing to link the decision of home buying poor people and people of color to the mortgage debacle instead of the financial institutions. How did that rant manage to be the impetus to form the Tea Party?
Well, I think at that point, that was in February of 2009. It's important to remember the bailouts had already been underway for nearly a year if you count the J.P. Morgan Chase subsidized purchase of Bear Stearns. And about $2 trillion had already been spent bailing out the banks and the Wall Street companies that got us into the mess. But it wasn't until Obama put forward this Homeowner Affordability Act that was designed to help individual and typically low-income minority homeowners in foreclosure that people got upset. And that was a $75 billion program, which was only about a 20th of what had been spent up to that point. And I think the reason for that was the bank bailouts were an abstraction to most ordinary people. They couldn't see where all that money was going, and so it was hard for a lot of people to be outraged by it. But the leaders of the Tea Party were very canny in the sense that they focused on this program because it was a bailout of their next door neighbors. It was people that they knew, or at least that they saw, and it was instead of being angry at rich white people in lower Manhattan, they were now able to be angry at poor black people who maybe lived around the corner, and I think that was a key to the entire movement.
And so much of what is behind the financial crisis is opaque, is so complex, is so out of the reach of ordinary Americans, but it's also sort of proudly, our members of Congress, some of them are quite proud to be ignorant of these kinds of financial instruments.
Sure, yeah, and that's one of the leading sales points of the Tea Party is, you don't have to be a genius to understand the world and to be an effective leader. Look at me, I'm no genius, and that they almost literally say that. I mean, people like Michelle Bachmann or Sarah Palin. Yeah, I mean, the anti-intellectualism is a definite part of the rhetoric, which is problematic when it comes to this Wall Street material because you don't have to be Einstein to know this stuff, but you do have to make an intellectual commitment to understanding it. It's not something that you can understand in a 5-second catchphrase. You do need to put your head into it for a little while. And so by telling people that they don't need to study to get it, that's a major deception, and people are falling for it.
And are you somebody who has an economics background?
No.
So you dug deep and you managed to come up with, I think, very simple to understand analogies, most notably comparing Wall Street to sort of mafia dons and gamblers, to break down what's really happening. I want to talk about Alan Greenspan and the title of the chapter that you have devoted to Alan Greenspan. We cannot say on the air. You call him the biggest blank in the universe. And Alan Greenspan is someone that, he, as you say in your book, he's sort of been this poster child for the intellectual guy at the head of the Fed who everybody trusts, including the Democrats and the Republicans. And your analysis of him and delving into his background was the first time that I sort of realized that he really has few qualifications to do what he's doing.
Yeah, and as I researched the history of Alan Greenspan, it struck me that this is a person who had a lot more in common with sort of famous celebrity con men like the Maharishi that the Beatles used to follow, or L. Ron Hubbard. People who presented themselves as experts on something and were became famous for having a reputation for being famous, or having a reputation for being experts. Greenspan was known in the 70s as sort of a know-it-all economist who had a grip on everything. But actually, if you look into his background, he was wrong about almost every prediction that he ever made. And it also later turned out that he very poorly understood a lot of the key developments in financial innovation, particularly derivatives. He never really understood that stuff, even as he was arguing that they should not be regulated.
And he was an ardent follower of Ayn Rand,
right,
who is essentially this icon of the right, author of The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. But he knew her personally. He was sort of deeply in that cult.
Yeah, they had these little weekly chats over tea in her apartment in New York, and they were almost like these the pre-revolutionary Leninist cells, where these guys would get together and discuss the revolution. That's kind of what these meetings were like in Rand's apartment, and they would get together and talk about objectivism, what became objectivism, which is this whole idea of the government has no place at all in business except the army and police, and taxes should be minimal to nothing. And Greenspan, for the rest of his life, would superficially espouse all of these beliefs, but at the same time, he was building a massive welfare state for Wall Street, and he sort of embodied this contradiction, and that's kind of why I focused on him at the beginning of the book.
Well, the Deficit Commission's report is already revealing that Social Security is under attack, and Greenspan played a role in the defunding, if you will, to an extent, of Social Security. Tell us that story.
Well, this is an amazing story. That whole crisis that we had in the first Bush term, when we talked about how Social Security was effectively insolvent. What people don't realize is that way back in the beginning of Reagan's presidency, Reagan had all these ambitious things that he wanted to do, but he didn't have any money to pay for it because ostensibly he was going to be cutting taxes. So what they did is that he hired Alan Greenspan to chair a Social Security Commission, and Greenspan decided to raise Social Security taxes. Now, theoretically, Social Security taxes aren't supposed to go into the general budget. They're supposed to be in a box and go back to the people who paid the taxes later on in their life. But that's not what they did. They just took all this money from Social Security. They kind of used it for general expenditures. And it wasn't just Reagan. It was Reagan, the first Bush, Clinton, and then the second Bush. They all did the same thing. They effectively ate through this money that should have been kept away in a locked box. And then after they spent it all on deficit spending, they came back to us and said, "Oh, well, Social Security is insolvent. We have to privatize the program or get rid of it." It was a theft scheme. That's really all it was.